Julianne Ginter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Green Party's overall objective is to create and build a cleaner, fairer economy that works for all New Zealanders, not just those who already are doing quite well. And to that end, we've been advocating for a tax shift for some time. One aspect of that is closing the current tax loophole on housing. That's going to be one way to address part of the problem with Auckland's out-of-control housing market. We've seen house prices in Auckland increase 20% just in the last year. The current house price to income ratio in Auckland is about 8. To put that in perspective, in Wellington, it's about 4. There are other cities overseas that are experiencing worse house price inflation relative to incomes, but there aren't very many cities like that. And overall, not only is that bad because it makes it more difficult to ensure that every New Zealander has a warm, safe, dry, secure place to call home, which is incredibly important, but also it's a risk to the economy as a whole. And the Reserve Bank's been talking about that for some time. There's a whole bunch of issues that we need to address in order to deal with housing affordability. So on the one hand, we have to deal with the demand side. So that starts with closing the tax loophole on property. That's only fair. It's only fair that we would tax income from property sales in the same way that we tax income from other types of work. It doesn't make sense that somebody who makes hundreds of thousands of dollars simply because they bought a house in Auckland at the right time and they sold it later, that income wouldn't be subject to tax in the same way it would be for those people who go to work every day and earn their paycheck. It also distorts the market to have this tax loophole because it means that there's all sorts of problems. The first one is it contributes to wealth inequality in New Zealand. So we have growing wealth inequality in New Zealand. That's the gap between those who have and have not. It distorts how people make investment choices. They're more likely to invest in the housing market than they are into the productive sectors of the economy, the way that we actually earn our way in the world. That in turn contributes to our current account deficit, which can affect the overall financial stability of the country. So we want to close the tax loophole on housing. There's different ways of doing that. I don't believe this bill goes very far in that direction, but it is a tiny little step. So we will reluctantly be supporting the bill at first reading, and we will look forward to the submissions and conversations in Select Committee, although I suspect it's going to be a very protracted process because the government needs to get this through as quickly as possible. Other ways that we can address the demand side problem in Auckland include limiting the impact of foreign capital. That's not to say that we're opposed to people migrating to New Zealand and living here, but if they are going to migrate and be residents or citizens, that's great. But if we don't put some restrictions on the sale of property to foreigners, then we end up having a lot of foreign capital come in that ultimately is not beneficial for New Zealanders. It makes it harder to ensure that all New Zealanders have a place to live. It bids up the value of houses in places like Auckland, so that's problematic. And the Green Party has a very practical solution to that, which is simply, if you want to buy property in New Zealand, you have to be a resident or a citizen. It's pretty simple, and lots of other comparable jurisdictions overseas do just that. Another way that we can reduce the demand pressure on housing in New Zealand is to protect renters. We actually have some of the worst the least comprehensive regime for looking after those people who are renting here in this country. It's for that reason that the Green Party proposed recently a warrant of fitness on rental properties. It's really, really important that everybody, no matter whether they're living in their own home or whether they're renting, that they're sure that their home is warm and dry and secure. We have a real problem with substandard housing. And without having regulations, what ends up happening is we have a race to the bottom and we have really poor, cold, shoddy rental housing. And protecting renters impacts the demand side in two ways, because it takes pressure off those who maybe don't want to buy a house but just want to have a secure place to live. And at the moment, they've got no guarantee of being able to live in a place and ensure that it's being looked after. So there's more pressure for people who maybe want more flexibility to go ahead and buy a house. And of course, it gets those dodgy landlords out of the housing market who currently are simply landlords because they're sure that they can make a tax-free capital gain in the future. They're not actually investing in the housing stock. They're not looking after their tenants. And so, it's really important that we protect those renters, and that's going to help get some marginal landlords out of the market, and it's also going to take pressure off those who are looking to buy houses. On the supply side, which the government's always talking about, there are some things that we can do, and the Green Party advocates. So allowing more multifamily dwellings in places where land values are really high. That is places that are close to lots of jobs, close to education. At the moment, we have a number of district plans, particularly the proposed unitary plans and plan rules in Auckland around the residential zones, actually prevent intensification. So there's a market out there for people who want to live in high quality apartments, townhouses, character flats, and they simply aren't being provided because government regulation actually makes it uneconomic and impossible to provide. So this is an area where one would hope that the Green Party could build an area of agreement with those who are constantly banging on about reducing local government regulations that are onerous, and yet this government actually isn't doing much in that area. I haven't seen anything so far that would enable more high quality apartments to be built where people really want to live. The other supply side issue is, of course, the involvement of government in providing homes, and we think that government should be providing more state houses. If you look at the places where housing markets are working really well in OECD countries, there is significant involvement from government in provision of houses, whether that's at the council level or at central government level. I note that the Royal Commission on Auckland Governance recommended that there was quite an important role for councils to play in providing social housing, and that, of course, has been completely ignored by this government. So we will support this bill with extreme reluctance because it does take some tiny steps towards closing the tax loophole on housing. But I can see immediately from the bill as introduced that there are a couple of problems with it. I mean, firstly, the 2-year time frame, way too short. I think Treasury's recommendations, if you go back a few years when they were recommending to government that they take action on this, which they finally have, they were looking at least 5 years. But really, why have a time limit at all? Does it matter what the intention is? If we have people who are earning money because they've bought property at the right time and sold it at the right time, why shouldn't that income be subject to tax, just like income is subject to tax if you're an engineer or you're a doctor or you're a factory worker? Why not? We already have exemptions in this bill for the family home and for cases like inheritance and relationship breakup. So it's unclear to me why we need to have this 2-year time limit. I don't think it will do much, certainly won't raise much revenue, but also it's going to affect a fairly small proportion of house sales. Since we already have the exemption for homes, for family homes, I don't see why we wouldn't have at least a longer time frame or no time limit at all. If it's not your family home, pay income tax on the income earned from owning the property. The other problem with it, of course, is that it only applies to residential land. Really, this fails pretty much all tests of how you would be implementing a tax regime. If you want it to be simple, you want it to be comprehensive, you don't want a lot of exemptions, and this limiting it to residential land, I think, is extremely problematic because the distortion that exists with the tax loophole on property isn't just a distortion that is impacted on housing. It also exists for all types of land, even if it's zoned for other uses. So I think that the national government ultimately has bowed to public pressure, to the pressure being put on by economists and by the Reserve Bank, who said they had to do something about Auckland's out-of-control property market because it is a risk to the economy and it's not good for people living in Auckland. But this bill is too little, too late. It's not going to make a difference. And the Green Party will reluctantly be supporting it because it's better than nothing, but it's certainly not enough.
Mr. Speaker.
I call Fletcher Tabato.